Welcome to the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Greene, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change. All right. Well, I am really happy to be sitting down this afternoon with a guest who I have not yet met before. So that's exciting for me to meet Jonny Miller. And Jonny, I'll just give a short introduction before we jump into a conversation. But Jonny is a breath worker, a coach, educator, a podcaster. He is the host of the podcast Curious Humans, which is a space to celebrate shared inquiry, explore self-experimentation, and cultivate embodied wisdom. Thoughtful deep dives with elders, poets, philosophers, and polymaths. So we'll maybe talk more about the podcast, but an excellent one to add to your list. Jonny's also the developer of an online course called the Nervous System Mastery, which is a 5-week boot camp for nervous system regulation, which all of you listening to this podcast know that nervous system regulation is near and dear to my heart. And I found Jonny by following him on Twitter, now known as X, where he is posts a lot of content and thoughtful and thought-provoking information. And so, Jonny, that's how I connected with you and plugged into your work. And we're nearby geographically. I'm in Boulder, Colorado today, and Jonny is in Sunshine Canyon, just around the corner. So here we are for a conversation about breathwork, embodiment, and nervous system mastery. Thank you, Jonny, for being here.
Thank you for the kind intro, Alex. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this as well.
Yeah, wonderful. You know, my podcast theme is beginning to follow a little bit of a template. The template being, I always want to know, sort of how people got here in a way. And following your work on Twitter, what grabbed me so much was a diversity of things that you've been interested, everything from meditation, breath work, embodiment work, working on performance and coaching and trauma and all of the above. Many of those are shared interests of mine. Some I have less experience with. And so I guess my first question is, if we sort of rewound in time, could you share just some of the influences or things that led you to bring your own curiosity towards these areas?
Yeah. So for me, I think this chapter of my life really started just over 6 years ago now. I was teaching entrepreneurship in London. I'd had a startup before that. I kind of came from the tech world.
Sure.
And I was engaged at the time to amazing women who had bipolar disorder. Mm-hmm. And one morning when I was actually in Portugal at the time, she had an anxiety attack at work. She was working as a junior doctor and she overdosed on her own medication and ended up taking her own life. And that was really my, it floored me at the time, as you can imagine. But it was the journey into and through and almost like apprenticing to grief in a way that really opened me up to a lot of this like inner landscape exploration of all the things that you just mentioned in the intro, from breathwork, meditation, embodiment, plant medicine, somatic practices. And it really opened me up to how numb I'd been to my kind of emotional experience before then as well. So it really just blasted open the door in a way. And I think I've had many influences along that path. I think I'm naturally someone who tries to read as widely as possible and try and get as many different diverse perspectives and then identify what are the common threads between these things. So the breathwork training was very formative for me. reading the work of Kathy Kane, Stephen Porge, Peter Levine, who
Sure.
I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Yep.
And really just my own experience, kind of being a guinea pig, like N of one, and seeing what has helped me, and then eventually kind of finding ways to share it has been my path.
Yeah. Wonderful. There was one, well, actually, firstly, yeah, I mean, what a painful initiation. And I'm so sorry to hear that, that first piece. So just wanted to mention that. There was a story that caught my attention in one thing I followed, which was, I think it was your description of a retreat. It was a kind of a unique one in my view. I think it was almost a week or somewhere in that neighborhood spent in complete 100% pitch black darkness. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So this was in Mazunte, Mexico, on the Oaxacan coast, and we'd done a 10-day meditation retreat at a place called Redaya, and they had an option that was called a dark room retreat, where they basically put you in a room that was maybe like 8 foot by 8 foot, kind of has a bed, a simple toilet, a yoga mat, and close the door. And I can't remember why I decided to do this in the beginning, but I decided to just try it for 10 days, basically. Most people, start a day or two, and I was like, oh, I feel, I no, I do remember now. There was a book by Mantak Chia called Darkness Technology. And in this book, he said that between days 6 to 9, DMT is endogenously released through the pineal gland. And I was like, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to experience that. I want to see what that's like. And so I on the back of this 10-day meditation retreat, which was very, very well done.
Sure.
I went into a dark room for 10 days, and it was a very nourishing and beautiful experience. Actually, I would definitely do it again.
I think it's a little vague in my memory, but there was you wrote well, or sort of your description of re-emerging. I mean, there were phases of the time in darkness, but there was something that struck me about your senses and your perception of the world around you. Do you remember what that kind of coming back into light was like?
Yeah, I do. So my partner, now wife, Kelly, knocked on my door at 6 a.m. And I put a blindfold on, and she walked me down to the beach that was near to where the dark room was. And when I opened my eyes, it was the sun was just rising, and it was this. It was almost like I was on psychedelics. That the lights were just so vibrant and intense, honestly, and I felt like that lasted for at least a couple of days afterwards, and there was just this renewed sense of like appreciation as well for having the beauty that comes in through our eyes that we just take for granted most of the time. It was it was really special. I imagine the same would be true, if you didn't hear anything for 10 days, and then you hear a beautiful piece of classical music, and you're like, wow, this is
Sure.
It just really refines the sense.
Yeah. Having done that, would you do it again? Was this a one-time thing, or something you would seek out again, do you think?
Yeah, I definitely would do it again, actually. I think, especially since then, I've picked up a broader variety of different meditation tools and techniques that I think I'd be curious to try in that specific environment as well. I would be curious to see how the experience changed with maybe a slightly different intention.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. So one of the themes that I hoped to delve in on was the breath work. And, when I first reached out, that was the topic I had sort of identified. And just to sort of share on my side, I don't have any breathwork specific training although certainly it comes up frequently in somatic experiencing. We attend to breath in TRE, tension and trauma releasing exercises, changes in the breath. As a structural integration body worker, we're working with the breath. So it's been sort of adjacent or actually implicit within a lot of the work that I've done. And then in even my own meditation background is in the Zen tradition, and it's really centered around a pretty particular breath practice. So breath has been an interest, but I see so much around. It feels to me that breath work as a somatic modality may be having a bit of a moment, or at least as compared to 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And I see all kinds of names. There's holotropic breath work coming from Stanislav Grof's tradition, and transformational breath work, similar conscious connected breathing, Butaiko breathing. There's James Nestor's book, Breathe. So pranayama coming from yoga. Somebody just introduced me to an organization, Soma Breath. And then there's the one that I learned through your podcast with Edward Dangerfield. What is it? Facilitated. Remind me the
breath repatterning, FBR.
Yeah, FBR. This breath repatterning. So anyway, so there's I wonder if you could just touch upon the field as a whole, and then we could weave our way towards your deep dive studying the FBR method and some of what you've received from that.
Sure. So, I mean, right now it's a very complex landscape, and I think it's actually quite confusing for people kind of coming at it for the first time. There was actually a study that was released by Guy Fincham, who's a great follow on Twitter. He's a breathwork researcher, and he attempted to map out all of these different modalities and like the origins and lineages and where they came from.
Sure.
The way that I tend to think about it is like there's two main categories. One category is the state changing kind of pranayama. So like conscious control of the breath in order to change the state of your nervous system. So it could be usually down regulation or up regulation breathing practice. Could be box breathing, could be alternate nostril breathing, these kinds of things. And they're normally used for a period of a few minutes, and they have a very specific effects on your state. And then there's the second category in which holotropic, rebirthing, facilitated breath repatterning all kind of fall into, which is the more extended like breathwork journeys. And these typically last anywhere between an hour to sometimes 3 hours long in the case of holotropic breathwork. And the purpose of these sessions, I mean, we can go into breath repatterning specifically because I think that it is somewhat unique compared to the others. But
Sure.
Generally by connecting your breath and breathing in a certain way, it very quickly creates an altered state of consciousness, kind of like a trance state, in which, as with somatic experiencing, subconscious material, incomplete reflexes, repressed emotions tend to rise to the surface.
Right.
Yeah, and be felt, be completed, be integrated. And so these different breathwork journeys, and it's also ideally it's in an in-person setting. There's almost always a playlist as well, which informs the kind of emotional tone and the intensity of the experience. The journeys tend to follow a bell curve, so they'll about halfway through they'll reach a peak, and then they'll kind of soften down into integration and relaxation. And I've done, I would say, several hundred of these breath repatterning journeys at this point. And it's been my main tool for self-exploration and kind of unpacking these stored, I call it emotional debt, like things that had happened to me that weren't fully processed or integrated, that my body had been holding on to, as I'm sure you're well aware of through somatic experiencing. So I view it as a similar tool to somatic experiencing. However, it kind of bypasses the mental component. So there doesn't need to be a story or even an understanding of what happened. You simply go back to whatever that was in the body and allow the wisdom of the nervous system to complete the experience with whatever's entailed.
Yeah, wonderful. So in my own background, so I've probably done about a dozen sessions of what the person called transformational breathwork, which I think is sort of adjacent to
Mm-hmm.
holotropic breathwork. There was music. There was first some upregulating pranayama, and then it was a style of breathing of a little more rapid than typical, in a sustained fashion. And for me. So definitely a crossover with somatic experiencing, but a big difference, at least in my um, dozen or so journeys, was that journey is an accurate word, because in my view these were essentially psychedelic, adjacent kinds of experiences, sometimes very present and present for what's arising, other times in a less present in a cognitive sense, um, and but all very, very powerful. So one thing we may touch upon, because I want to hear how things are held in the FBR sort of style, but one difference that I see when I connect somatic experiencing to, say, something as I don't know, uh, what's the word, a um, less controlled. I don't know. I'll have to come back to what the word is, but and maybe it is. I got a hint from the conversation that I listened to with you with Edward, and there's this concept of breath work as a vehicle for shutting down the default mode network, and then therefore what is it that comes up? And in somatic work we might say the procedural memory or implicit memory, or that may sort of be arising. And in my own view of SE is that, which I love, it's a core modality of mine, but it's more of a both and. The default mode network is there, and there's a feeling into, or a capacity building around sensing, what else, and following incomplete motor responses, and all of that. So anyway, but coming back to your work with the FBR, could you share more, especially for those listeners who don't even know the starting point? Just maybe you could share how you found it, and what connected you to that approach, and then just I don't know, paint a picture of how it works a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, of course. So I originally actually came through holotropic in the beginning. I was doing a freediving training whilst I was in Bali, and
Okay.
my teacher was also a holotropic breathwork practitioner. And on one of the off days, he was like, "Do you want to do this breathwork journey?" And I was like, "Sure, that sounds interesting." And yeah, I had a very powerful, slightly out of bodied experience, and I was like, oh my gosh, this was, like you just said, psychedelic. This was
Right.
way, way, way more intense than I'd imagined when I began. And then I think, let's see, I actually met Ed in a sauna in Bali. We used to go to the same sauna and cold plunge together. And through a series of conversations, I just became fascinated by both his journey. He was in an avalanche, and how he came into breathwork, and then eventually said, like, "Hey, I'd love to experience what this breath repatterning
Sure.
for myself," and did a one-on-one session, kind of lay down on his table, and again just had an incredibly profound and cathartic experience, and ended up just going back and having more of these, and just wanting to know what on earth is happening on the table when my arm is twitching and moving, and then anger comes through, and then sad. It's like the full spectrum of emotions just starts to kind of pour out in
Right.
this particular container.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, there were so many aspects that I found particularly interesting. I'd say what is unique about this breath repatterning approach is that
Sure.
there is a thesis or an idea that our breathing rhythms are correlated to our emotional patterns. And so if we're unable to breathe into a certain part of our body or breathe in a certain way, that reduced dynamism correlates to a reduced emotional access. And so,
Sure.
and you can start to, when you start to see kind of themes or recurring patterns in when you brief people as a facilitator, and you can generally get a sense for which emotions people feel comfortable expressing in their life and which ones they tend to shy away from. You can see their nervous system capacity. The breath almost becomes like a mirror to how they show up in life. And by creating space for the breath to be more dynamic, essentially have more capacity, both in terms of the inhale and the exhale, that creates greater capacity and resilience in their lives as well. And that was certainly true for me. And I've had some amazing experiences from people that I've breathed as well, who've said it's really changed their life in some situations. Yeah.
Wonderful. With a curiosity I have about FBR is, when as I shared, my point of reference with the basically the holotropic breath work, it was sort of like the same format every time. Essentially, a pretty similar style of breathing, although the experience itself might lead in a different direction. And as I was listening to your really lovely deep dive with Ed Dangerfield, I found myself curious. Is it similar that there's sort of a protocol that is essentially similarly a particular style of breathing, or is there something that's more responsive to the particular pattern that you're observing in the client, or that sort of thing?
Yeah. So from the client's perspective, the breathing pattern is the same every time. It's a full vibrant inhale and a relaxed, effortless exhale. There are no pauses at the top or the bottom, so it's a circular breath, and the body is relaxed and the mouth is open. That's basically, from the breather's perspective, all that they need to
think
track.
about.
Yeah, but then from the facilitator's perspective, this is either one-on-one or very small groups, like 1 to 3. Then we are essentially reading their breathing pattern and doing a real-time translation, and then making adjustments, facilitations, hand placements, verbal cues, unweighting limbs for nerve flossing to basically explore based on what we're seeing and tracking. And if something does move and complete, you can then see, like, has that landed in their breathing pattern? Has it now shifted? Is the breath now going down into the lower diaphragm, into the pelvic floor? Are they breathing into their upper rib cage? Is it not getting stuck past the diaphragm? There's all these things which can be which we're tracking, and generally and this is actually where it differs in an important way from, say, holotropic breathing, because there is this relaxed exhale. What a lot of people struggle with, and myself included, is there's often like a full breath in, and then there's a holding, and there's a kind of constriction in the neck and a tightness in the jaw. And that Ed kind of calls this like the overachiever breathing pattern. It's like it signifies a kind of maybe over controlling in various areas of life, and a challenge with downshifting. And so what we tend to work on with a lot of people is increasing that capacity for like a completely relaxed, effortless exhale. And the exhale is, as I'm sure you know, the parasympathetic part of the nervous system.
Sure.
And so I think why the reason I moved away from holotropic myself is because, although it can create these psychedelic type experiences, and if that's what you're after, then that's fine. But it can, because of that, it can also lead to disassociation. People just kind of check out, and they leave their bodies, and they might have all of these insights and experiences, but it's from a therapeutic perspective, I don't know how much good that is actually doing. And if anything, it's maybe reinforcing this like over efforting, this cyclic hyperventilation, which is further inhibiting their capacity to relax into the downshifting into like ventral vagal.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this this concept of just a full relaxed exhalation, something like a sigh or just a release. And I feel so much validation. And I don't know when Andrew Huberman did his research on the physiological sigh, what he calls the physiological sigh. I can't remember, but it only came in my world in the last year or two. And the validation was that for about 10 years, my approach with my clients, whether it's body work, SE, TRE, whatever, the most common homework assignment that I give when I'm in a new relationship is I say, if you've lost your ability to have an authentic sigh, which many of us have because we're socialized out of it and all kinds of reasons why, then step number one is when you're driving or you're alone or you're not in a self-conscious setting. Yeah, I love it. Yes, thank you. Is reclaim your ability to sigh, and that was always sort of the starting point for wherever, it's like that's the number one thing that you can be working on, and then we'll continue down the road. And what I appreciate with Andrew Huberman's research is that and I don't know all the details, but the bullet point that I took from it was that the physiological sigh was in many ways the most direct and the easiest route, the quickest route to a parasympathetic nervous system response, when as measured against a variety of other sort of breathing practices. So anyway, I feel like, and so hearing that component certainly resonates with what I've been wondering about it as well.
Yeah. I mean, as a practitioner, if someone's going through a particularly intense experience and we're looking to kind of bring the breathwork journey to a close, we'll often, or I'll often maybe put a hand on their belly and just almost like mimic that or demonstrate it and just be like, and then apply some downward pressure to the belly and just induce this this kind of sense of relaxation. And sometimes it takes 5, 10, 15 minutes for it to come through, but eventually it does. And it's a really clear sign that the body's like, okay,
everything's
I'm good. Yeah.
Right. And you can feel it. I mean, you can feel the change in the room, I think, when that availability is there. Yeah. Yeah. I love that you're yawning. Can I share? And I told you a little bit briefly, but you're modeling what I said before we hit record, which is when I'm with new clients, when I say, whenever we're in a space together, whether it's online or in person, my number one goal for us is that all the normal rules of being in our bodies, like don't fidget, sit up straight, eyes have to be open. If you're going to yawn, somebody's going to think you're bored or tired or, all these interpretations. I say, in this setting, I would feel what I would is like, let's just give ourselves permission. If I feel like slouching, slouch. If you're going to yawn, go ahead and yawn. And so I'm happy to feel that we can do that even in our recording here today.
Yeah. I love that. And are there any other kind of spontaneous movements that you feel like are commonly inhibited, which are actually helpful? Because I feel like something that I've learned through breathwork is that the body naturally knows what it needs to do in order to release energy, in order to downshift. And it's actually these social inhibitions, which are the reason that we even need to do things like somatic experiencing or breathwork, because we have all this stored up emotional debt. So are there any other things that you've noticed things?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're naming it really well in terms of the why of it. And I think the phrase I always use is in SE is listen and follow, which is not super specific, but the listen is if my body could do whatever it wants, what would it do next? And the follow is let that thing happen. And so certainly movements of sometimes it's that you'll see people loosen up their shoulders, because they haven't moved in a while, or definitely sighing and yawning is a common one. But even postural changes, like, I'll sit down with some clients for, a 50-minute session. And if we didn't say anything, they might sit in the same exact position for 50 minutes because they're used to doing that in a work meeting. And for whatever reason, they've gotten the idea that's it becomes unconscious at that point. But given permission, I would say almost no one would maintain the same seated position for 50 minutes. That more commonly there might be a posture change. So things like that for sure. Yeah, I mean, emotional expression would be another piece. I mean, that's sort of a one step further down the line. If we were having a conversation and, you felt for whatever reason, some grief, well, most social settings, we're not going to allow that to come through in an uninhibited way. Right. So, and to some extent, there's reasons why social conventions are there, but I think you said it really beautifully. If that becomes our normal, then I really like your terms, emotional debt and allostatic debt, that if we're just constantly in that state of management, then there's an accumulation. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So anyway, I'm trying to in my little way, it's the normalizing of, hey,
totally.
Don't stand on ceremony. Let yourself yawn. I'll let all that jazz. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Awesome. When I heard the descriptions of the FBR, I was so intrigued as a therapeutic practitioner myself, because there was so much overlap with certain of the like with the nerve flossing and the unweighting limbs and some of the touch work that you described in that episode. So much overlap with, one of the schools of work that I do is called myofascial release. And there's this concept of myofascial unwinding, which is where we can facilitate, movement through touch and very similarly, touch supporting and unweighting and then allowing spontaneous movement to occur. And then something that's much more central to my work and the theme of probably, at least 2/3 of my podcast episodes so far, because is my main modality, is this thing called TRE, which, if you're not familiar with it, is about something called neurogenic tremoring, which is, I'm certain actually you see it in your breathwork practice, but the idea that under certain states of relaxation, a tremoring pattern in the muscles will emerge. And sometimes it's sort of a steady state phenomenon, but then it often then sort of moves into movement patterns that may correspond to completion of motor responses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I heard the descriptions of the facilitation that you do in FBR, I just was thinking, to me, it was almost like an inverse thing. It's like I'm paying attention to the body and the tremoring, and I notice the breath, and it's important to me. And I sometimes use the breath as a way to deepen the process in my own sort of intuitive way. But the reason I hear this inverse relationship is there's this other way, which is you can prioritize breath, and then the other things that happen around it are happening. And of course, there's no real distinction between these two things. But that was just sort of my impression as I heard.
Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact that Ed and Satori, who's the research assistant, they've both studied somatic experiencing and a plethora of different bodywork modalities that have been brought into this, what is now wrapped up in FBR. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, my interpretation is that the breath is a very efficient way of kind of getting someone into process, like dropped in basically. And once they're in that state, then there's all different kinds of, I see it as almost like experiments that you can run on their body, on their nervous system, and just pay attention to what shifts and what happens, with the view of creating the conditions for that kind of release with embodied safety as well. And there's often a kind of a line, and I think where the breath is very helpful is you can generally see where someone is at in terms of their window of tolerance through the breath. And if they're if they're right on the edge, then I'm probably not going to unweight a limb or do some kind, or like jab in their pelvic floor, because that's going to push them outside. But if I feel like they have really big capacity, then I might feel bolder in terms of what I attempt to elicit from the body. So it's almost like an additional feedback that I'm getting, whilst all of this other stuff is going on as well.
I see. Wonderful. Well, so your training was in Bali, and then you may travel now, or you may be based in the U.S. I'm not sure. But what? And in a few minutes, I want to hear about the nervous system direction and the coursework. But I'm curious, what how active in the breathwork facilitation are you currently? Who are you serving? Yeah, what's that part of your professional work like these days?
Yeah, so I did a lot of sessions in Bali, where we were living there for about a year and a half, and I spent some more time before that as well. Since moving to Boulder, my wife and I moved here about a year ago. I've done some in-person sessions. Some people have flown out from New York. There's a lot of people from New York that seem to come here and want to do breathwork. So I've done some sessions, but yeah, honestly, it hasn't been a focus of mine recently. Partly due to not having an ideal space in the house we were in. We've moved house recently.
Sure.
And also, I think wanting to really focus on the nervous system side of things as well, which just to explain briefly, I view almost as an on-ramp to things like somatic experiencing, breath work, all of the different somatic modalities. I feel like there was a kind of foundational theoretical and practical understanding that I lacked when I first went into this work. And so what I'm viewing the course as is really an on-ramp to some of these deeper, ideally in-person, one-on-one arenas for deep work. And in the course itself, I believe there's also inherent and intrinsic value in the practices themselves. But essentially, I'm kind of trying to promote the type of work that you're doing and create an open source directory of practitioners around the world as well. And just because not many people understand what actually happens in like in this type of context. And I find it so fascinating and so useful and so efficient as well when you compare to, someone might go to talk therapy for a decade and not have any real breakthroughs, and then they go into an SE session or a breathwork session and they have this like life-changing shift. And it's for me, I'm just passionate about honestly sharing like the work that you're doing and this world.
Well, something that comes through in spades in your websites and your podcast and your writing is the tremendous your natural instinct as an educator and a communicator, a synthesizer of ideas. And so something I appreciate so much in even just the sort of the description of the nervous system mastery course is this idea of, hey, you probably didn't learn very much about your nervous system. I didn't know a lot either, but I'm going to go out and do the research and look at find the best stuff, make sure it's legit and peer reviewed and bring it together. And so to me, what a service that's being offered through that platform. And I've had the luck of working with two people who came through your nervous system mastery 5-week course. Oh, cool. Both of whom have nothing but just tremendous, they got tremendous growth and learning and practical tools. And for me as an SE guy, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, great, they already know all these things. It's on their radar. Great. They not only know like 4-hour session, but they're already bringing it into, that awareness is seeping into their daily activities and daily life. So, cool. so super cool thing. But yeah, I wonder, without revealing anything that's, deep in the bowels of the course itself. I mean, could you share just, what's included? Tell us about the 5-week program.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to be an open book as well, and I've written about quite a few of these concepts and practices publicly as well. I can maybe share some links afterwards.
Great.
But the essential outline of the course, or the core pillars, the core practices are interoceptive practice, so building somatic awareness, which I really view as foundational. If you don't have that, it's very challenging to see benefits from the others.
Okay.
So there's various, I call it APE, which stands for awareness, posture, emotion. And there's kind of a guided body scan that I encourage people to do every day to build this interoceptive awareness practice.
And can we pause just from a definitional? Could you just for somebody who hasn't heard interoception yet? Yeah.
Totally. So it's another jargon term is somatic awareness, but what that basically means is the ability to sense, track, and feel your internal landscape, your inner experience. So everything from how your breath is moving to tracking your heartbeat to noticing tension, contraction, sensation, tingling, anything that is like interior that is happening in your body, just bringing awareness to that and listening to it. And just noticing it, basically.
Sure.
And for me, speaking personally, I had an interoceptive capacity of basically 0 when I was in my teenage years and 20s, and it really is a skill that you can learn and something that comes over time. And even noticing that an area is numb is a form of, like, that is a feeling. That's like a form of interoceptive.
Sure.
Noticing. So yeah, I think it's such a foundational, and it connects to our intuition. It connects to our decision making. It connects to, like, how we feel around certain people, and so, like, it's such a superpower that I think most people just don't realize they're missing. And if you're listening to this and you're like, what is he talking about? Like, I think that's fine too, but it's just very gentle. Like, often starting with the breath is a good place to begin, because it's often easier for people to connect with. But yeah, that's the interoceptive piece. And then the second piece, which is I think what gets a lot of people through the door, is the piece around self-regulation protocols. So these are, I say, if this, then breathe. So like, if I'm feeling anxious, then do this breath. If I'm feeling lethargic, do this breath. If I'm feeling overwhelmed, do this breath. And it's real-time, essentially pranayama practices to downshift or upshift your nervous system depending on what is appropriate. And also for building embodied safety as well. There's practices for that side of things. Sure. And then the third piece is what I call emotional fluidity, which is slightly different from emotional regulation, but it's basically practicing being comfortable feeling the full spectrum of human emotions. And this is the piece which, people get like a little taste in this 5-week course, and they understand some of the principles. And I have this practice called somatic surfing. That's kind of like a self-guided SE journey in a way, where you're just going in, you're connecting to an emotional sensation and following it, exploring it, seeing what's there. And yeah, and then with the intention of over time, and for me, this has been a multi-year journey, honestly, but feeling comfortable and welcoming all emotions. That's like anger, shame, helplessness, fear, like really becoming comfortable with not only the stories, but like the felt sensations with these, and allowing them to just pass through. So that's.
Can I ask a question about that pillar? Because
yeah,
I mean, that sounds like such an important one. And you said earlier a phrase I really resonate with, which is, most of us, we have those emotions that we're comfortable in and that are easy for us to express, whether that's, we're hot under the collar and, we anger easily. That's fine. We're comfortable with that emotion, but we're not comfortable with, vulnerability or grief or, something like that. And I find that so true. And so this idea of, how do we find more range? What's the in the context of your program, how beyond just sort of naming that as a thing that hey, we've got our gaps in our we likely have our gaps. What are your methods? Is it through group work? Is it through sharing? Is it how do you encourage people to step into those those areas where they may not have as much familiarity?
Mm. Yeah, great question. So there's a few like self-guided journaling practices. So say emotional mapping is one where they'll pick three emotions, one that they're comfortable with, and then two that they're less familiar with,
Okay.
and tracking what are the sensations that are associated with those feelings and stories, and just kind of like getting to know them better from all of those different perspectives. We then have some group practices that are done through breakout rooms, and a kind of like a visualization into different feelings as well. And I'm something that I'm thinking about for this cohort as well is creating a kind of like an emotional dojo, like a dyad practice, where people are kind of paired up and given the opportunity to, again, going into like something that's like a 3 out of 10, so not something that's super intense, but just enough to kind of get a sense and explore that together. But that's the piece that I'm still figuring out how to effectively and safely share this online. I think there's definitely certain things which really should be reserved for in-person, one-on-one kind of therapeutic containers. But
Sure.
I also really want to give people a taste for like what is possible and the freedom that is on the other side of some of these feelings that people might have. And I think the other thing that was certainly a shift for me was realizing that what I thought was fear was actually my resistance to fear. What I thought was anger was actually my resistance to the anger. And that fully welcoming and feeling something all the way through is actually a very different sense. I call it like clean anger, or healthy anger.
Yep.
And anger is, I think, one of the biggest ones for me. And I've certainly correlated it to people that have repressed anger tend to, or can get depressed. And I've seen like once they come into contact with being able to express anger in a safe way, the depression tends to just
Shift and lift. Yeah.
So I think that's a big one to begin with.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's still something that I'm exploring. There's a number of, there's MRES, I don't know if you've heard of Doug's bioemotive framework. I'm kind of exploring these different emotional release modalities and practices and frameworks and seeing what combination is appropriate for the course.
Oh, cool. Well, so that, I think we touched on three pillars. Well, there was interoception. I'm blanking on the second one. And then there was the emotional, remind us, and then don't let me interrupt you. Finish the,
So interoception, self-regulation, emotional fluidity. And then the fourth one is environment design. So it's becoming aware of how we are being shaped and designed by our environments. That can be our home, can be the people we're around, and doing an inventory of that, and then making more intentional changes. So especially sleep is a big piece, particularly for people who may be recovering from burnout or have anxiety, like really designing, I call it a sleep sanctuary, and kind of putting in some fairly practical pieces to just sleep better can make a big difference. And then the other kind of overarching framework I call Rise Out of Reactivity, which kind of brings all of these together. And RISE is an acronym for R is reactivity, I is interoception, S is self-regulation, the E is emotional fluidity. And so it's like the idea of the course is to help live a life that is less reactive and more intentional. And by working on these three different pillars, you kind of rise up this pyramid and you rise out of the reactivity. So that's the kind of the cohesive framework that brings it all together.
Cool. So I mean, everybody, and I like the breadth of your curious human, and as a I like the I think that you believe your audience is humanity, but who burnout is big. It sounds like from your previous kind of career. I'm thinking that that part of your circles are people who are still engaged in the stress levels associated with that type of work. But yeah, who are you finding is really benefiting from this framework that you're putting together?
Yeah, so initially it was mostly kind of tech founders, leaders, execs. That was kind of my background. But the last two cohorts, it's really broadened, honestly, to where it's now quite hard for me to define. But I would say, I mean, there's firefighters, there's teachers, there's a lot of parents, especially with young kids. There are other educators, other somatic practitioners who are kind of curious to broaden their skill set. There's coaches, and then still the kind of entrepreneurs, founders, that audience as well.
Sure.
Some people with health challenges, health conditions they've been working on. It's becoming quite a broad thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah, we all relate to these nervous systems. If you only had a couple minutes with if you met a burned out executive in a longer than usual elevator ride, and you only had a chance to convey a couple of things that you would wish you'd learned earlier on, what would be your top three pointers, do you think?
Good question. With a lot of the kind of type A high achievers, the permission piece is huge. Like often they will feel guilty for taking time off to rest and recover. So like explicitly giving yourself or getting permission from whoever you're working with to rest is freaking key in the beginning. And boundaries to create spaciousness and to take things off your plate, like that can just be a kind of initial no-brainer. I think for someone who is on the edge of burnout or in burnout, practices like yoga nidra or NSDR are incredibly helpful because they reset the dopamine system, they help to build interoception, and they really just allow the body to rest. Like if someone's in burnout, then really just like rest is key in the early stages. And then as we've just been talking about, finding some form of somatic or emotional exploration, ideally in a one-on-one setting with a somatic therapist like yourself or breath worker. But finding a way to address what is likely to be a lot of accumulated emotional debt that's under the surface. Like the stuff, like get yourself to a place where you can function. You're rested. You've got good boundaries in place. Maybe you take a sabbatical, whatever it is, and then then have the courage to kind of dive into the. I like to think of it as like the inner adventure. It's like it's not going to be easy necessarily. It's probably there's going to be things that you've spent your whole life consciously or subconsciously running from. Yeah, and that's the only thing that's really good. That's really what I view these crises that people go through, whether it's a health crisis, whether they lose their job, whether they lose someone close to them. These crises are invitations into the inner experience and the inner landscape.
Right.
And sometimes it does take a crisis for someone to kind of pay attention. Yeah. And I say that is probably a common thread between a lot of people that come through the course is they've been through something challenging, be it health crisis, be it lost loved one, be it burnout. That tends to be a theme.
Yeah. There's with burnout specifically, I feel like I've come across this phenomenon a number of times where I've supported a lot of people in through that and I love your most immediate tips, that permission, which to me often having some psychoeducation, which is I think a real strength of what you're doing there, is just educating so people understand it's not that I'm weak, that I need a recovery, that I need more rest, but that there's very solid physiological rationale. So anybody who kind of needs an explanation that might help with that permission. And then just some of those basics, yoga nidra and restorative yoga, or, things that just the basics of promoting a parasympathetic or more restful kind of experience. But I have this thing now, which is like, when somebody retires after a high stress job, or if they've left a job because of burnout, I have this feeling in my own body, which is like, okay, I'll do this with you, but like, there's gonna be like this 2-month period where that's a rocky road, and you're gonna, a week in, you're gonna think you should be going back to work, and then you're gonna feel tireder than you've ever felt in your life. And there's a part of me that's like, I don't know if I've got it in me for the early messy phase of sort of seeing what happens when somebody who's been go, and then now they've rest either by choice or they've had to. It's a really volatile period in my experience, often with quite confusing for the person going through it. And so to me, such a unique thing. What have you seen in that? Did you resonate at all with kind of how I read that early phase? Or
yeah, totally. So the way that I view it through the lens of polyvagal theory that I imagine you're familiar with, where people kind of oscillate between dorsal shutdown, which is this like collapse freeze state, and then into hyperarousal, which there can be anger, frustration, anxiety up here, and they just kind of like seesaw or swing, pendulate between the two. And over time, those pendulations become less intense, but it does take like you say, it can take weeks or sometimes months for those to kind of like even out, because there is all of this underlying emotional debt, allostatic load, which is finally becomes present and obvious, but then it takes time for the body to really recover.
Yeah. Wild times. What's, so, you mentioned like, you're learning new things, I think of you as a person who's kind of constantly iterating your approach and your projects. Where are you headed with this nervous system work? And what are your hopes for it, and where's it heading?
I appreciate the question. I would like to. There's a number of different projects I'm excited about right now. There's improving the curriculum and the community experience, and the experience for the alumni as well. Creating a series of sub courses, like micro courses that are specific to anxiety or depression, or just that kind of go into more detail these symptoms that people come into with. I'd love to create a card deck for these emotional resilience protocols, these nervous system protocols. Still interviewing, basically through the podcast is my own channel for learning and interviewing people that I respect in this space who have perspectives that I would like to try and integrate. So recently spoke with Jim Dethmer from the Conscious Leadership Group, and he had some great things to say. I'm excited to speak to someone around attachment theory and kind of bring that lens into this work as well. And also more in-person things. So doing a men's retreat next spring with a good friend of mine that will include in-person breathwork journeys as well. And I think also find a way to continue to communicate these ideas in a way that resonates with a broader audience and people outside of our kind of niche somatic circles,
right?
Which can be a bit of an echo chamber sometimes. So maybe that'll be through YouTube videos, through more podcasts, more writing, and continue to just experiment really and find ways of sharing.
Wonderful. Well, how can, so of course we'll put all the links in the show notes, but what are the most easy ways to connect to your work? Which channels?
Yes. So as you mentioned, I'm really active on Twitter. Like my handle's annoyingly, it's Jonny and then M1LLER. I'll change it at some point, but that's the Twitter handle if you're on Twitter. And then the podcast is called Curious Humans. It's available on most podcast players. And there's some great if this conversation resonated, there'd probably be a bunch on there that would also be relevant. Like the one with Ed, with Michael Ashcroft, with my friend Connie. And then the Nervous System Mastery course we have applications open right now. The website is nsmastery.com, and there's like an application form and all the details on that website as well. Yeah, and then I have some essays that are published on every.2, and I can maybe send you the links to include.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And some of those go into, there's an essay on interoception, an essay on emotional debt, an essay on breathwork regulation protocols. So a lot of I'm trying to kind of open source as much of this material as possible. And then the course is more of just like there's accountability, there's a community, there's Q&A sessions, expert teachers. So it's more of a deeper dive.
When does the next cohort begin for the mastery course?
The application, the enrollment ends on September the 15th, and then we're kicking off a week later.
Oh, great. Yeah. Great. Perfect. All right. Well, Jonny, thank you so much, and appreciate this time.
Yeah, me too. This was really fun. Thank you.
All right. Great. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.